Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. This is Kevin Koym. I want to welcome you back to the VO Weekly, the Venture Outfitter Weekly. Today, we're going to be talking about everything that we know about bootstrapping. This is like an extension of the conversation we were having last week. Last week, you might remember, the whole conversation we were talking about was the issues that the venture markets, the investors are actually saying. I shared clips. For those of y'all that didn't see the program, I shared clips of different things that different investors were actually saying from some of the different conversations that I got to listen in on about what's happening in investment markets. And because it looks like the market's going down, and because it looks like the investors are kind of being a little bit more shy, bootstrapping is kind of the answer. We'll talk about that today in today's Venture Outfitter Weekly. I'm real excited. We're doing some experiments today by spooling things out or streaming things out to other properties. We're going to be streaming more to Facebook and to LinkedIn, and hopefully you're able to see these fine. I'd always love to get feedback about what's happening, because part of what we're wanting to do, given that we've got some good momentum about our programming that's upcoming and stuff like that, your feedback is always appreciated about the program, and anything you'd like to see, other dimensions, other ideas. Feedback could be, hey, your audio quality sucks. Or it could be, hey, what I'd really like to see is a conversation about X, Y, or Z. Okay, so definitely let us know. I want to say thank you to DualWorks. DualWorks is the sponsor of our studio here at their co-working facility, which is at 183 Mopac. In Austin, Texas. 183 in Mopac, for those of you that don't know. If you look at Austin, the MTA, the overall area of Austin, this happens to be dead in the center of all the activity in between Dell towards the north, and downtown is not the center of activity in Austin. If you look at kind of where things are set up, Linda Blackman and her team have a really great facility here. It's more approachable than a lot of the other co-working places because it's so accessible. And I appreciate the work that they do. And thank you for being one of our long-term sponsors. If you're looking for anything specific, or if you want something nuanced in the relationship that you have, like especially for those of you that are international entrepreneurs that need a point of presence in the United States, they really know how to work that out. So take advantage of it. Today's thought for the day. I've been drawn to be more provocative with our thoughts for the day, not just nice little expressions of like, have a good day, because I think entrepreneurs have to be in growth mode. And this statement from this Russian named Vladimir Yakolev is quite provocative. And if you read the overall, article, anyone that liked to read the overall article, it's about this much text. I was reading it and I was like, wow, that's provocative. But I'm only going to read the punchline of the quote. What is more important is whether we realize to what extent our personal fears today, in our own sense of external threat, are actually just the ghost of the past that we were so afraid to look in the eye. We're about to talk about bootstrapping. We're talking about a harder market to grow a company in. It's actually a great time to start a company because the markets themselves are becoming more shy with capital to invest. And so today's conversation is about bootstrapping. And in my life of the ventures I've started over the last 30 years, the thing that I think is provocative to think about is how all of these things are happening. Like as you look at, if you look at what's happening in the world and what it's going to take to be a successful bootstrapper, and we're going to hear the words of one of our bootstrappers from our community, as well as the words of a really successful guy that exited his company $3.5 billion. And if you look at it with this lens of this quote, I think you're going to hear something really interesting about the challenge, the personal challenge that you as the entrepreneur need to take on in bootstrapping your business. So we'll talk more about that. But what is more important is whether we realize to what extent our personal fears today and our own sense of external threat are actually just the ghost of the past that we are so afraid to look in the eye. I'll make sure that Jello posts the overall quote into one of the chat, not the chats, but the overall, like the thing is about something happening in Russia, but it's very provocative because it speaks to all of us. It's coming soon. So we have a number of different things that are happening with the coming soon VO weeklies. You're going to see a lot more activity about this, but to tell you a little bit about what's happening. September 8th, what ecosystem leaders never talk about with entrepreneurs, the inner game of entrepreneurship. I think that this is one of my favorite topics. Obviously, the previous quote was about this. We're going to really talk about like boiling down, like, or for the longest time, I called TechRanch an entrepreneur development organization. And the reason I think that those words are so important is because that inner game is what we're going to dedicate next week's talk about. Today is going to be about bootstrapping the venture, but next week we'll make sure that we're actually talking more about the inner game, even more so. September 15th, getting cozy with the corporates. Right now, a lot of the corporations that are downsizing, this is a great time to be innovating and be working with them. So this talk on the 15th, and I'd like to have interaction if you have examples of when you have been partnered up with a larger corporation. I'd love to hear that. I'll be talking about some of those 18 different skunk works that I built as well. You know, many of them in a down market where the corporations were like, hey, we have to innovate to survive, right? A lot of the companies that are out there don't innovate, don't survive. I'm actually going to also make sure that we invite a number of different corporations, corporate people to listen into this as well. So those of you all that are in the studio audience that want to be involved in the behind the scenes conversation, it'll be interesting. And by September 15th, you'll start seeing a lot more promotion. You know, it's back to school time for those of y'all that have kids, and it's back to school time for the TechRanch. So you'll see a lot more promotions with what's going to be happening. And then we'll have, obviously we'll have events on September 22nd and September 29th. We haven't finalized the speakers on those two talks, so we're not publishing the names yet of what is going to happen, but there will be VO weeklies for those times. We're tossing around a couple different things to work out about that. But then October 6th, I am going to be in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and we're going to hear from entrepreneurs on the ground there. It'll be more of, hey, let's peer into a part of the world that actually I don't know that much about, and what can we learn from there as well. So that'll be on October 6th, and it'll be, let's see, it'll be 9 o'clock at night when I'm there, but I'll have a group of entrepreneurs for us to hear from. In fact, in our studio audience today, we have one of our newest entrepreneurial fellows from Tashkent. Her name is Maftuna. We'll actually, we might even get to hear from her in a little bit if she's able to share a few things. She had a bad connection before we actually went on live. So hopefully we'll get to hear from her. So today we're going to talk about activities around the startup, around the venture itself. You know, the whole idea about these different domains, the 6 different domains that we talk about during VO Weekly. I just, you know, next week, obviously, we're going to be talking about the self, but this time we're going to talk about the venture. And I always think that it's important to go across all the different areas. If you have things that you'd like to actually ever share back and forth about this, I always love to hear that. And I'd like to actually make sure, you know, we have a space for that. Now I'm going to look at the, let's see, hopping into the LinkedIn, see if there's people posting there. For whatever reason, it's not yet come up on my screen about our live thing. But for those of y'all that are in the studio audience as well, I always invite, I know that Melvin is typically also in the LinkedIn stream. You might share the LinkedIn stream because a lot of times it's great to actually comment back and forth there because we get a larger group of people interacting with the conversation. And we will pay attention to the what's being said there on the program so that we can actually pull some of those comments back in here. So everything we know about bootstrapping, I'm going to share initially some of my thoughts about bootstrapping and some of the stories, because a lot of times people forget, especially in the venture world, they read about in the paper or in a magazine or online somewhere. They read about, these big fanciful stories about these entrepreneurs that get these insane amounts of money invested in the companies. And, oh, that must be the way that we do this whole venture thing. And it's not necessarily true. So I want to make sure we break down some of the stereotypes about that. We're also going to hear from one of our, the TechCrunch community's own in a little bit as well. But what is bootstrapping? So there's a lot of stories that are being told about bootstrapping. One of my favorite ones that I've read about is that, there's this one German guy that in the 1800s, got caught in quicksand and pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Now, the story is actually that he didn't pull himself up by his bootstraps. He somehow pulled his hair and got himself out of the quicksand. I don't know if the story is true or not, but it's widely regarded as, like, when you read books about entrepreneurship, that, there's several different people. In fact, one of my business partners on building Bootstrap Austin, which is a group of us formed, a group of entrepreneurs that got up to 800 entrepreneurs in Austin starting in 2003, between 2003 and 2008. And it was because of that group that so many of us were able to get our businesses off the ground and, get them to success. A lot of people forget about this whole idea, but let's talk a little bit more about bootstrapping. So the essence of bootstrapping is you start a venture and you're crossing the venture valley of death. The investors won't touch you because you don't yet have customers. You might not have your business model figured out yet. And the red is you're not just losing money, you're losing blood, you're losing sweat, you're losing tears. And the thing that we talk about now, for those of you all that come to campfire programs before, one of the things that I like to talk about is that the only thing that will get you across the venture valley of death, especially in a down market, is not going to be funding. If you notice where the dot is on funding, it's after the break-even point. Break-even point meaning when you start making money. The thing that it represents is you all that crisis that's happening. The only thing that you really can find capital-wise is going to be social capital. And as a reminder, that's what we do in our community. Social capital, not financial capital, is what really gets you across that. And even companies like Intel, if you hear the story of Andy Grove and the beginning of Intel, part of what they did get funding, but they still were really, 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 really cash efficient in their operations. They didn't go out and buy millions of dollars of furniture. Like one of the companies that I like making fun of here in Austin, that is no longer around. It blew up. They raised all these funding and they had amazing offices, and you could tell by some of the mahogany in the office that they were spending money like going out of business. And they did go out of business. They actually spent $3 million on a Super Bowl ad and never shipped any software. But on the other side, you have companies like the Gopro story. Gopro, this little camera. The founders, Nick Woodman it's a couple that founded the company. Nick Woodman had started a couple other ventures. The ventures blew up, and he needed to kind of get ready. I mean, after he needed a little bit of time to cool off after his venturing. So he went to Australia and he essentially went not snowboarding. He went surfing. And while he was surfing, he noticed that there was no camera equipment that he can actually have to take pictures and take videos on the surfboard that would actually stick with him. And he said, hey, wait, I want to scratch that itch, go do something about this. And he's saying this quote, I think, that speaks to the internal conversation that I started hinting at earlier today, is he said, I am going to die before I give up on this effort. Now, at some point, we'll do a retrospective about looking across Gopro, because there's been articles about how Nick has actually lost his soul after he sold his company for $3.5 billion. That's a different story. What I really want to frame in on is when he started bootstrapping it, and he wanted to scratch his own itch being his desire for building a company or building a product that he could actually capture these stories. or these videos of being on a surfboard. And there's been a lot of bootstrapped companies that have been wildly successful. You'll see everything from hardware ones like Adafruit. We'll see companies like MailChimp. You'll see, Shutterstock. I mean, there's quite a few different ones here that, like, I never would have imagined that Zoho was one of the ones that was, that didn't feel like it was bootstrapped, but it was, largely been reported bootstrapped. GitHub, those guys sold for, I don't know how many billions, but like at least $1 billion. So other things that are happening here. A few more companies as well on the second screen. But there's some interesting articles about this. And one of the ones that I liked that we'll put into the show notes that I think was really well articulated was this gentleman, this article is in NASDAQ, or is NASDAQ Online. Said some things, and I think he articulated kind of some of my feelings in a way that I thought were really good. Get traction before you're all in. In the words of Sun Tzu, first make yourself invulnerable, then find the vulnerability in your opponent. Your opponent is not your competition. Your opponent, when you're bootstrapping especially, is getting off the ground. First make yourself invulnerable, then find the vulnerability in your opponent. He's saying that's my way of saying of what he says. Get traction before you're all in. Don't take a risk on something where you're risking your life and limb, before you do that. Stay close to your money. Pay attention to where the money's going. Like if you should know whether it's every latte that you're having or whatever it might be, you should know exactly where the dollars are going. Be mindful when hiring. In bootstrapping, you really can't hire, but now with websites like Fiverr.com and Upwork, you can actually get specific skills. Just reach out, attach them. You don't necessarily have to hire for long term. When I built my first company, the company that built the e-commerce engine behind Dell, I staffed up too big and I had difficulties about that. I wish that we'd had Fiverr and Upwork and tools like that. I wish that we'd had a community where we could draw in on other capabilities, or reach out to someone else and just get social capital. Like I didn't have marketing experts in a community because at the time Austin kind of sucked because it didn't have that many professionals in the startup space. We're talking about in the early 90s, by the way. Next thing, build a solid brand. This is where it even counts more than anything else, right? To build a solid brand. What do they mean by build a solid brand? You can figure out more about what your company stands for when you're really in those rough moments. The rough moments of why is it that you're choosing to take this on? A lot of the people that I've met that have ventures that have been really well funded, I think a lot of times those founders lose a little bit of their souls because they're just focused on the funding versus the, why the brand essence. And we're going to hear from David in a little bit. He's got quite a story about his venture and, some of the suffering he's gone through, but also we'll hear some of the story about why it matters in the world. And then find advisors. I'll say it this way, finding advisors in the context of the Tech Ranch community, which, by the way, we're within a week going to launch the first version of the Next community software, because I've heard your feedback that no one likes Mighty Networks and no one likes Slack. So we're fixing that, but that'll be a separate thing. Finding advisors, finding running buddies as well. Running buddies could be like in the studio audience, there's several of my running buddies that are here. Kim and Melvin and David and Sebastian. I've all done work with, they've never worked for me. I've never worked for them, but peer to peer, we've supported each other back and forth as peers. That's when I say social capital earlier. So this gentleman that wrote this article about, I bootstrapped a biz that sold for 60 million. He says, find advisors. My thing is to say, find your peers that you can share social capital. It could be something as simple as, hey, David, can I ask you a question or two about the following areas? Because David knows more about certain elements of the business than I do. So why don't I share, 5 minutes of my knowledge and save him a bunch of money on stuff, and where he'll share a bunch of his knowledge as well back with me the same way. That's what we do in the community. The other thing that I want to specifically speak about this article, that if it doesn't jump out at you, previously when we talked about GoPro sold for $3.5 billion. This gentleman sold his business for $60 million. Now, the great thing about bootstrapping a company and selling it for $60 million is he's going to have more than enough money to do whatever he wants, even if he only has $5 million of that he kept for himself, that's well invested for the rest of his life and probably for his children's lives. As long as he doesn't squander the money, he's essentially done. So the next venture that he starts is there. One of the things that bootstrappers can do, and we've seen, there's another company, the founder never likes me to actually tell which company it is, but one of our companies that was in our early co-working space, he sold his company for $30 million. He's continuing launching companies. But by having a first $30 million exit, that him and his co-founder actually essentially, it was pretty much their money. So I don't know how much money they actually have in the bank, but probably each one of them has in excess of 10 million in the bank, just sort of sitting there, allowing them to do whatever they want. The other thing that's important to think about as you think about bootstrapping a business is not necessarily having billionaire dreams, but to focus on an earlier exit. There's a book, a really good book called the Early Exit by Basil, and I'm going to forget Basil's last name, but it actually says, hey, don't go for the $1 billion thing. Create a success that then you can capture value so that you get to do the next venture and the next venture, the next venture. All right, so that's kind of my, I could go into more detail about bootstrapping, but I think that I would rather introduce you to someone that I admire, I enjoy, and I enjoy interacting with. A gentleman by the name of David Potes, who started a company called Apollo Health. He's launched several different versions off of this. He's used Apollo Health as a launching pad for another venture that he's going to tell us about. His company was discovered in the venture bridge. We called it the innovation bridge that the federal government of Mexico launched with TechRanch between 2018 and 2019. And he continues to be involved in the TechRanch. In fact, I'm really honored by the way he participates in our community. If you don't know him, you should get to know him as well. He's now on the board of our nonprofit too. So thank you for your commitment to the community, David. But David, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know that you have quite the history of startups and backgrounds. You've got a story about what happened with where you got to on building your company. Tell us about it.
Sure.
David Potes, Monterrey, Mexico.
Thank you, Kevin. So I'm just thinking where to start. I'll just give you the first of all the general pitch of what we do. We started with Apollo Health, like Kevin mentioned, and Apollo is a company that, like you saw on the slide, we help to attract patients to and connect them with healthcare providers and how to retain those patients. And I mean, just to go a little bit deep into that, our idea of what healthcare should be is more of a, and let me rephrase that. Our idea of how the relationship between a patient and a healthcare provider should be, it should be more continuous and more understanding that the patient is not the client, quote unquote, when they need help, when they need any type of health service. It should be their client, even when they're healthy, and how to maintain that health. And I mean, I could go talking about that all day. And of course, it depends a lot of regulation and policies in each country. But the main thing is that we started to develop this strategy of how to help both the patient and the healthcare provider to first, and seeing it from the healthcare provider's perspective, how to attract that patient and retain that patient. That is not a common concept in the healthcare space. And I mean, first of all, we say that we evangelize a little bit with the healthcare providers and educating them in how it costs a lot more to obtain new patients, like it costs a lot more to obtain new clients in whatever sector industry than to retain the existing patients, right? So in that sense, we launch a software to facilitate that connection between both of them, and how to interact and how to even modify their business model so that they can offer preventive services and be aware of what the patient needs, not only when when he or she is sick or injured, but also when they're healthy, right? So the story with bootstrapping is that there's several things to consider in my case. And Kevin, I don't know how much should I talk about this, but let me know if I need to be faster.
I would love to. I mean, I enjoy your story because you've been committed to the health of others in a way. Like it's truly, you've really driven activities like that. So I'd love to actually have as much as you like to share.
Okay, I'll try to be really concise, but let me know if I start to wonder, whatever. But first of all, with raising capital and looking for investment, I have to talk about the healthcare industry here in Mexico. There's not a lot of investment going into healthcare, and I mean there was recently, of course, because of the pandemic, there was a lot of investment going, or some investment going into telemedicine services and things like that, because because of the pandemic. All you can understand that there was a little bit of a trend with that, right? But at the end, it has also to do a lot with my DNA and the education that I received with my father. He being more old school and not understanding a lot about raising capital and what is the business behind that. He always told me that if we wanted to raise capital in any way, that I should seek more to have traction first. I mean, if we have traction, we could then start to raise capital so that we can have a way to build a bit to expand the business we're already building. So I'm trying to make long story short. Basically, with Apollo, we started to have a couple of clients. We started to receive some income that was, quote unquote, just enough to stay in business. But one of the things that we started to see, and at the first, from one side, I did have a lot of investment talks and things like that, but people still didn't see what was the solution. Maybe the fault was on my side, that didn't explain correctly what it is. Maybe it was because of the particularities of the healthcare system in Mexico, where our solution is that kind of problem that we're solving, that people don't see it as a problem because it's just the status quo, right? It's just the way it works. So what we started to do also at the same time is that we started to see that a lot of potential clients, or even our clients, weren't exploiting what we could do with the solutions that we were offering in terms of even our consulting services. Like I mentioned, trying to change their business model and things like that. They were okay how they were. So that gave us an idea to do it ourselves, so to say, in the sense of, we said, okay, maybe what we need to do is go directly to the patients and start offering certain services ourselves and be an extension or our articulation of the services that healthcare providers offer in Mexico. So that's where we came up with the idea to create this kind of a virtual hospital. And that virtual hospital is basically, this is very common in the US. It's not at all common in Mexico, actually. From my research, and we've done a lot of research, we're the only ones that are starting to offer this kind of services. And basically what we did is we started to, because of what we had done previously with Apollo and analyzing the patient journey, how the patient has to navigate the healthcare system, we understood that there were a lot of gaps between navigating between different healthcare providers. So our idea with the virtual hospital is that we are going to close those gaps. And the way we're going to do it is that how we can offer services, guide the patient, and help them between their transitions between healthcare providers, healthcare services, and then at the end how to keep them healthy.
David, let me ask you a question real quick.
Please.
Interrupt you with the question. So one of the things that I'm wondering is, that sounds expensive to be educating the client. And one of the things that's hard is, here you are bootstrapping and you're doing something that's, you're actually having to educate, hey, all these capabilities are there. I mean, for me, that sounds scary, because a lot of times, especially those of us that are used to being innovators, like you are, like I am, it's how do you make sure that you take care of yourself and take care of the venture when you're having to educate as well as sell?
Yes, I mean that's a really interesting question. I see it like a part of our everyday, but that's interesting to analyze. And has to do with one of the things you mentioned earlier, talking about social capital. One of the things that we did earlier was to start an agreement and start to emerge with a hospital group here in Mexico. That is a group of 52 hospitals that are practically from one point of the country to the another. It's the largest hospital group here in Mexico, and in terms of territory and in terms of hospitals in that group. And in that group, we analyzed which hospitals were the ones that were more progressive in terms of innovation, in terms of the ones that we could sell the project more easily to. And that's what we did. We went to a couple of hospitals, one of them here in Monterrey, one of them also in north of Mexico in Hermosillo. And they were how you say, they were really excited about the idea. And because of that, we have been getting data and starting to build a business case out of that. So we can showcase to the other hospitals and show the benefits of doing this, implementing these solutions. And at the same time, what I was mentioning about social capital, and that's one social capital that we actually went into that. But at the same time, we started to we believe a lot in and it's the same idea of social capital, and this idea of I'm sorry, I forgot the term, of how we can create economy between using merging works between different companies, right? The same idea in sort of way that Uber doesn't have any actual cars. I mean, it's kind of the same idea. We start to create alliances or create business relationships with companies that we can both together grow in that way. So for example, for the virtual hospital, we're using part of our software, but we have we needed a lot of other solutions that we didn't have. So we found this company. It's from guys that are from Venezuela. They're the immigrants living in Miami, and they built this really interesting software that we are starting to use. And we came up with this agreement that they're not going to charge us to start a business with this, but we are going to we're going to grow together as the business starts to get some traction, right? So, and that's just one of the examples that we have. I mean, we've been doing this a lot, like asking favors, and then we are offering, we give favors back, and that kind of stuff, like you mentioned before, about how we never work together, but at the same time we help each other, and just about asking for advice, but at the same time asking for either a connection or proposing an idea of how we can grow together in this type of scenarios, right? But yeah, I mean, in terms of educating the client, it sometimes is really exhausted, but at the same time, I understand that it's part of the things that we need to do in terms of innovating the healthcare sector. It's a system that has been working the same way for over 40, 50 years. And it's hard to break that sometimes, right? And of course, I mean, I'm just talking about the good parts of my story, but and this and all of the story, I mean, we have had ups and downs and moments. I was ready to throw my desk away and say I quit. And at one point, there was this entrepreneur or this businessman that is starting kind of like a same type of business, but to another market. And he was like, I don't know if this is the same expression in English, but he was, we say that moving the floor a little bit to, like he was tempting me with the idea of becoming a co-founder and CEO of his company. And I was like, okay, that could be more stable, and that could be, a way to, not be that worried about our business. But I mean, for whatever reason, didn't work. But at the same time, I mean, I'm pretty sure that what we have and what we're doing, because I mean, just to get a little bit into that, and it has to do with our vision of what healthcare should be. His specific solution was aiming to the high part of the pyramid, the social pyramid. So I mean, and what we're trying to do is to make healthcare more accessible to different social levels, to make it more financial accessible, and to promote what it's a common thing going on in healthcare right now that is called healthcare equity. So I mean, that's one of the reasons that it didn't work. But at the same time, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that there's this sometimes tempting, I don't know to say it this way, this tempting offerings to go to another path and maybe go into a 9-to-5 work. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but in my case, I know it's not what I want to do, and sometimes I just have to take it a day at a time and I mean, just continue to go one step at a time. I don't know if that makes sense.
What was the thing that happened that's actually helped you? I mean, that can be difficult, right? And you had a stalking horse that you almost stepped into. Like, one of the things that I think is important is to share a little bit of the internal kind of conversation. It's really easy to recognize, hey, this might be a lot easier to take this other position or something like that, to step out of the venture. Tell us a little bit about the grit that it took to actually stick with it.
Sure. So I mean, it was a couple of things. One of them being that, I mean, I wasn't having that connection with this person, but at the same time, when we started to discuss the business and what were his goals and what he wanted me to do with his business, I just didn't see what was the I mean, that personal realization about probably the same thing that in the example that you mentioned about the founder of Gopro, is that, I mean, you kind of feel like you'll be, of course, being more settled and having kind of financial certainty and things like that, but at the same time that you're kind of like deviating from what you settled to solve or to try to solve, and maybe that would be a better term. So I mean, he was looking to give healthcare services to that population that already has healthcare insurance here in Mexico, that is around 7% of the population, that is quote unquote easier. Okay, of course, it's easier to aim for that type of market because they already have insurance, because I mean, the payment is going to be easier. You're going to charge thousands of dollars for healthcare services. He actually he showed me a couple of the invoices of previous clients, and I mean, it was around, I'm not exaggerating, it was around $20,000. That I don't know if that's a lot for a healthcare bill in the US, but here in Mexico, $20,000, it's a lot for a healthcare bill. So and this was just for a quick in and out, right, service. so I mean, at the same time, I was trying to tell them, you know what, I mean, that's interesting what you're doing, but there's also there's a high percentage of the population that is completely forgotten in terms of offering them healthcare services, and it has a lot to do with volume. It probably won't be those giant invoices, but I mean, it has to do with a lot with volume. It has to do a lot with going to offer more accessible healthcare services for that population. And I mean, it just we didn't see eye to eye in that sense. So I mean, I think that was one of the reasons that it didn't work out. But mainly at the end, I mean, I talked with my wife about it, and she saw that even though it was a good opportunity for I mean, us to get a little bit more financially stable, she was the first person to say, you know what, I don't think this is a good idea. So I mean that also helped me a lot to talk to my wife and talk to my family and with my father, who's always been a great advisor for me, and see that, I mean,
Well, yeah,
that was
that
not.
sort of stuff really can make a that can make a lot of differences of having that type of support in your home, in your family. That's a beautiful thing as well to recognize. Hey, let me do this. So David, I know I want to ask you 1,000 other questions, because when I look at your background, and I know some of the stories that you've gone through since we've known each other for all the way back to 2018, 2019. I always appreciate the story, because you're going into a market like we said earlier, that's resistant to change. Healthcare is really resistant to change, and you're educating people in a way as you're doing it. I like the idea that you said it was that one key relationship with the hospital that created the platform that then you've now gone to 49 or 50 something hospitals too, right? That first one was the one that actually did that. You explored with partnerships, that idea, the Venezuelan company based out of Miami that has a piece of technology that you could go to and say, hey, I don't necessarily have the money to just pay you to be your customer, but I will open up this whole other market, right? That's really interesting that you came up with that. A lot of times when I talk to the community about working with each other, not to see each other as customers, but to see each other as prospective go-to-market partners, right? That's what you're saying with that, right? That idea, or sometimes they use the conceptual metaphor of a school of piranhas. If we want to take on the whales and the sharks of the world, like healthcare market is a whale, right? It moves slow, it can crush you. It doesn't really, it kind of just thinks for itself. It's just going to keep on doing. If you want to take on with that, then a school of piranhas is about the only way you can really do that, given that we're all small. You won't be able to necessarily do it alone, and having go-to-market partners like the company you mentioned. That's interesting. So exploring with partners.
Yeah, I remember the term about I forgot earlier. It's collaborative economy. I don't know if I'm pronouncing
Collaborative economy. Got it. Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I mean, a lot of what we're all learning is this idea back and forth of how open source software teaches us this, right? We see these big groups of thousands and thousands and thousands of parties that are working back and forth with each other. Some of them that never touch, some of them that just share code, right? And some of them from that same thing. We don't necessarily have to be open source. We don't have to share it, but that idea of being collaborative as a fundamental way of being in the business, that's an interesting idea. And then the third thing I heard is that that whole idea of commitment in the hard times. I really want us to dig in on that, especially in the next week's program, because I think that hard times are coming. I think they're actually, based on what we see in the market, there's some good things happening, and it's a great time to innovate. But also, I think there's going to be some difficulties, and so hearing about that is actually interesting.
Yeah, if I can add a little bit about that, I was just hearing this podcast. It's a really interesting podcast. It's in Spanish. It's this guy that has business people and invited to a podcast called Cracks, CRACKS. And he recently invited the CEO and founder of the first Mexican unicorn company. It's called Confio with Konfio. and they were talking specifically about this, about how, I mean, he had this idea, Confuse, a company that gives a financial credit to small, medium companies here in Mexico. And that's a market that it was completely forgotten also. So a lot of similarities with that. But at the same time, when he went and he started and he went to a lot of investors, and because of what the business, he needed the fund, right, to give credit. And I mean, they all told him that, you know, that market is completely, I mean, you shouldn't focus on that. That shouldn't be. So he went through a really rough time at the beginning. And one of the interesting, I bring this up because one of the interesting questions that the interviewers asked him was, when do you know if you need to be resilient and continue with the path, or you need to just give it up and focus on something else, right? And it was an interesting answer because I mean, a lot has to do with sometimes, and I always also ask him that question sometimes, because I don't know if you've seen that that drawing where this guy that is digging a hole and has given up and he's going back, but then there's the other guy on another level. He's just about one stroke from finding gold, and sometimes you're just there, right? And I mean, I don't think there's one answer to that question. I think a lot has to do with, you know, that gut feeling that I mean, you're looking for some, I mean, you're aiming to solve a problem that needs to be solved, and I mean, sometimes you need to.
Yeah, tenacity really counts. It's like a lot of the guys who carry those stoic coins. You know, it says the object is the reward, or not object, but the obstacle is the reward. That you almost have to go through it, like with stoicism. It's interesting.
Yeah.
And you know, as an example, I when I look back at my experience in e-commerce, I built one of the biggest websites in the world in e-commerce, but then got frustrated and kind of left it, and that's when all the people made all the money. So yeah, I get it. It's like it's an interesting thing to know. We have time for a question or two from either the studio audience or on the different places. Like, say, I am paying attention to the LinkedIn stream. If anyone would like to type in a question there, I'll pay attention to it. I have time for maybe a question or two from our Zoom audience. Does anyone have something they'd like to ask David or myself in the context of this topic? I don't know, David, you and I could actually have a conversation about this for forever. And I know that we would never run out of things, because one of the things about it is, I think once you've gone through a couple of the rough moments of the venture's history and you realize that you're still there, it's actually interesting. I know that I've seen that in with you. Like, I remember conversations during the middle of COVID, just like, you know, both of us have, as we had to lay off people and stuff like that, you know, we were a little bit zombie-ish,
Yeah.
like trying to make it through. The other thing I'll make sure that I mention is I give a talk about mentorship and having mentors, and there are 4 different types of mentors. And one of the most important types of mentors is not someone that, you know, has a lot more experience than you, but just running buddies. What is a running buddy? It's a peer to just reach out to. David received some of my calls where I'm like, oh crap, I just said it, like blah blah blah, and then the same thing, like where he's like, you know, and I could tell he was a little bit shell shocked. You know, it's like so that's another thing to do too, that based on our relationship, and there's a lot of relationships like that around Tech Ranch.
Yeah.
Maybe you could say something about that too. I know you have a couple of friends that you've told me about that are there in Monterey, that have been ones that, like one of them that went all the way back to middle school or something like that, that you've told me about. To say something about that too. How does someone find a running buddy?
Yeah, I mean, in my case, it has been a little bit rough because my group of friends, the ones that I grew up with, they all went and got, you know, 9-to-5 jobs and corporate jobs and things like that. So at the same time, you know, finding that relatable struggle. It wasn't easy, right? A lot of my friends were like, I mean, what are you doing, right? I mean, what are you trying to do in that sense? I mean, we joke about playing to be an entrepreneur, right? But one of my I mean, jokingly, I call him cousin, because our mothers grew up together. So I mean, I know him since we were practically babies. He went through the same thing, and I mean, we talk about this back and forth. He's the CEO and founder of Bitchfi, and I mean, I know how it started. I know the struggles. I know, I mean, the ups and downs of Bridgefy, and sometimes showing. I mean, they got I don't know how many million users already in the platform, but at the same time, it's not bringing in the income and the capital. So I mean, just figuring that out, it has been, and just seeing how he managed that, it's been. I mean, we share a lot about that. You know, it's really really interesting. I mean, and he has got a lot of traction with investors. I mean, he has really high quality investors in his company already. So I mean, that's a really interesting case.
Yeah, well, it's interesting just because I think that's really that's another thing that entrepreneurs are called on, that business people never really figure out is, or because they don't have to. How is it you can actually have that type of relationship that, like, one of my really good friends, his first name is John. I met him in college when we both were working as co-op students or engineering co-ops at IBM. He stayed at IBM. Here it is, however many years later, and I've been in, I don't know, I've started 7 different companies. Several of them I blew up and they fell apart and all that sort of stuff. I can have great drinks with John, but I have to have, like, it is important if you're taking on bootstrapping, especially, to have a couple of those relationships where it's entrepreneur to entrepreneur. And I want to make sure I point to that, because that's one of the things that I hope develops out of the Tech Ranch community, that more of you benefit from getting connected to a couple of different people, that where you actually start having those closer friendships. Not to take away from, I mean, I absolutely love and getting together with my buddy John. I haven't seen him, in the last little bit, but I really enjoy the time that I have with them as well. But it's not the same as being able to say, how is it you made through it that Thursday night to pay for employees on Friday morning, and what did you do? And when there's breakdowns and stuff like that. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming times. David, any last minute thing that you'd like to say really quick before we start?
I mean, just really quick about that. I mean, that was also one of the things that I found with TechCrunch. I mean, I mentioned this before, but I remember one of the first calls where you just said, you know what, this call is going to be about mental health. And so, hey guys, how are you? And just really talk about how we are. And I remember, I forgot his last name, but the other David from 3D Tia, and I remember one time he said, I'm just having trouble right now with making ends meet and things like that. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting, because at one point you feel like you're the only one going through the struggle, right? So just to have other entrepreneurs share, I mean, their struggles, and then not, you talk about entrepreneur porn, that not everything is, very successful. And I just opened a company and raised capital, and now I'm building it.
Yeah, like it can be depressing at times when all we hear about in the press is $3.5 billion sold, or what's his face from WeWork, just got Andreessen to give him another $300 million. I'm like, that is entrepreneur porn. It's like it's a little bit of a distraction and not realistic for most of the businesses, most of the small businesses, and certainly most of the startups that are out there. So
definitely.
Well, so let's do this, David. I always appreciate you sharing your story. I'm personally motivated by your path, and especially your commitment to revolutionizing healthcare, both in Mexico and other parts of the world. Part of what we'll do is we'll have you come back and tell us even more in the future, and
Sure.
and for other entrepreneurs as well. I think part of the Tech Ranch community, part of what I'd like to make sure that everyone's tapping into. There are a lot of places you can learn about business. There are a lot of places you can read, you can read the wonderful stories at Entrepreneur Magazine, or you can read, about this sort of stuff, and you can see people talk about how great they're just killing it. It's amazing, blah, blah, blah. But I think the thing that I'd actually like to make sure that we have more authentically in our community is talking about, those steps of taking things through the rough times. So thank you for sharing that story, and especially as we, it's really clear based on the market, we're going to have more bootstrapping going on. And part of the way that we bootstrap is working together, both, through the good, things to celebrate, as well as the rough stuff that we have to deal with. What I'll do is I'll start bringing things to a close by saying, if you're not in the community already, make sure that you get onto our email list. Make sure that you get onto our newsletter, our community. If you're in a different country, or if you want to make sure that that this work is represented in wherever you're from, sign up as a country manager. Sign up as a mentor if you have scar tissue to donate to other entrepreneurs. We will be launching a newer version of the community site by this time next week. It'll be a very simplistic launch, minimal viable product, but I'm kind of excited about that because you guys have been requesting easier ways of connecting in, and I think we've got some ideas about how to make that happen. So just in taking things to a close for today, it's always an honor to be here working with entrepreneurs that are driven by vision and values for making the world a better place. Let's go change the world for the better together. With that, we'll sign out for today. Thank you all very much for your work. And thank you, David, for the inspiration and your insight in bootstrapping. Y'all take care.